The border between the United States and Canada presents a unique national security challenge. Yet, when folks talk about border security in Washington, D.C., they almost always focus on the southern border. And while we have real challenges that need to be addressed at our border with Mexico, we cannot lose sight of what lies to the north. A border that sees the largest exchange of goods and people anywhere in the world. It's 5,500 miles long and sees 400,000 people and $1.6 billion in goods and services across it each and every day. This unique border requires a strategic plan to defend it. But when I came to Washington, I was alarmed to find that the northern border was often treated as an afterthought. That's why I worked on a bipartisan bill to require a comprehensive threat assessment of the northern border. That bill led to the Department of Homeland Security releasing an updated northern border strategy this past June. I recently convened a meeting of Customs and Border Protection officials, as well as local and tribal law enforcement, to discuss this new strategy and gain their input on how best to implement it. Today, we'll hear from two people with intimate knowledge of the northern border and its challenges. Mary Delaquis served 16 years as the area port director at Pembina, North Dakota, the busiest port of entry in the state and one of the top 5 busiest ports along the U.S.-Canadian border, with over 1 million private commercial vehicles passing through it every year. Mary was a great partner as I worked to pass legislation requiring an updated northern border threat assessment, and I'm so glad she's able to give us her upfront perspective on what Customs and Border Protection agents need to keep our communities safe and strong. Mary, you spent years along the northern border. How did the challenges and work of Customs and Border Protection along the border change over that time period?
Oh, they changed significantly. When I started, I was with the United States Customs Service, and of course, after 9/11, that all changed as they merged the U.S. Customs Service, U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, as well as the Department of Agriculture. All of those agencies, combined into one under DHS, and of course, that momentum that drove us for the next several years, of course, resulted in incredible increased security, increased officer presence, as well as just the technology that we had available to us, as well as just that whole mindset of the American people really, for the first time, really recognizing that this border needed to be secure and that we needed to have people trained and the proper tools available to those officers.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first came and I would talk about the northern border, people just didn't seem to even want to listen. And you just want to say, this is a huge border. This is when you push on the southern border, when you close off the maritime border, people are going to find a way to get in, and we need to make sure that we're resourced. Why do you think it's so hard to get attention to the issues that we have on the northern border?
Well, I think, first of all, just kind of a lack of information for most people that don't travel very much or really don't even acknowledge that border is even there. I think as a general, that hasn't changed in the last 20 years. The northern border, Canada's a friendly country. We think of them as our partners in whether it's trade or just in tourism, and most people don't think of it as a threat. And I think that's a big mistake. And you're exactly right. As we kind of put more focus on the airports, the seaports, the southwest border, all of a sudden people start to think, well, we can fly to Toronto, we can get into Vancouver, we can drive a car, we can drive a truck, we can fly an airplane right over that border. I just think it's a lack of information that most people just take for granted, is that nothing's going to happen there, and that's a huge mistake.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said a lot of people look at Canada and say, well, they're friendly. It's, and I'm guilty too. I always say, Manitoba and Saskatchewan to the North Dakotan is no different than someone from Minnesota and South Dakota. But that doesn't mean that we should not recognize that that's an international border and it needs to be protected. If you could give me 3 suggestions on what we could do to improve northern border security, what would they be, Mary?
I think it would be a real in-depth overview of what kind of traffic, whether it's passenger, whether it's commercial, whether it's even agriculture traffic, is actually coming across that border, and acknowledge that trade and that tourism and those passengers that are arriving are critical, not only to the United States, but also to our security and understanding who those people are and what they're doing and what we're actually accomplishing by having a border station there and talking to these individuals, looking at what they're bringing in, having those difficult conversations. And then, we must acknowledge that 90+% of the people and the commodities that cross that border are completely legitimate. We're trying to focus in on that small cadre of individuals or commodities that actually pose a risk to the United States. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think we need to have technology enhancements on the northern border. We need to have our X-ray systems in place. We need to have our radiation portals in place. They need to be operational. We need to have good secondary exam facilities so that the officers can do a quick and thorough, exam not only of commercial traffic but of passengers in their vehicles and quickly move them on their way. And of course, then we need to have the information and the intel that allows us to focus in on those individuals that mean to do us harm and that should not be allowed into the United States.
Well, Mary, I was just in Minot, and I did a roundtable, and I was recalling the times when I was Attorney General, and we used to go up to the border, whether it was Pembina or Cavalier or any place along the border, and when we did intels back and forth with law enforcement, whether it was county or city law enforcement, state drug enforcement, always the Royal Canadian Mounties were down, and Customs and Border Protection. And, one thing that I asked when we went around was exactly what you're saying, is a greater and more systematic sharing of intel. What are we seeing on either side of the border? And I think in some ways the enhanced kind of security that we have has kind of erected maybe even more borders law enforcement to law enforcement. And so, I promised that I would do everything that I could to get back to that collegiality that we've had with our neighbors to the north. And I know, coming up to Pembina, I've seen the great work that you've done in collaboration with the Canadian immigration and border protection folks. Can you talk a little bit about kind of where you are right now with Canada and how improving that relationship might help on both sides of the border?
Well, I've been retired for about a year and a half, but I have remains robust, at least in the North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan area. I'm not able to speak to other areas on the border. But that's one thing that we worked really, really diligently on, was building that rapport and that sharing of information, whether it's with local law enforcement. We have to have them, whether it's the sheriff's office, it's the county, whatever it happens to be on the U.S. side versus the Canadian side, whether it's the RCMP or even Canada Customs and Revenue Agency. That relationship needs to be strong. We need to have faith in one another. We need to be able to trust one another. As you know, there's a lot of space between the border stations, and even at the border stations where we maybe only have 2 officers working at any given time. We need to rely on our partners, the Canadians, whether it's the RCMP or Customs, and of course our local law enforcement agencies as well as the Office of Border Patrol. All of that. Those agencies need to work together in order to make sure that the borders are secure. And thankfully, that was in place when I left, and I have, like I said, every reason to believe it continues to be a really dynamic dialogue where we share information very quickly, and that information gets to the necessary people so that it allows us to do our jobs.
Well, we have an advantage on the northern border, and that is a kind of relationship with the Canadian national authorities, with the local authorities in Canada that, I'm not trying to put down the federales or any of the cross-border law enforcement, but we know that relationship in terms of trust and sharing intel is much stronger on the northern border, and we could really beef up our northern border security by continuing to do the things you did, Mary, when you were there, which is working to co-locate and work with our Canadian counterparts. It was a seamless kind of operation, and I think a lot of people, if they saw it, would say this is the way to go because we can really almost double the manpower by working together, but we've got to continue to have positive relationships with our neighbors to the north. It was interesting, Mary, because one of the things that the Northern Border Threat Assessment basically concluded was that one of the greatest threats was not one directional flow of drugs, but bi-directional flow of drugs across the border. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing without giving too much information is that with the southern border becoming hopefully more secure as time goes on, that there's a lot of concern about the northern border seeing drugs come across. And we've talked about the fentanyl market coming down from Canada and the post office. Maybe we can talk a little bit about drug enforcement and the kinds of things that you've seen that have changed over the years.
I think that we always had the understanding as customs officers, customs inspectors in the early years of my career that if we ever got the technology, to x-ray the commercial vehicles that came in or to do in-depth probes on gas tanks perhaps or look for special compartments inside of vehicles that were crossing the border, that, that would be the key to our success. But then we would find all of these drugs that were coming across the border. And during was the airport director and even an officer with customs, in the late 80s and early 90s, we saw a lot of personal use. But it was very rare or uncommon for us to actually find a big load. I mean, one of the biggest loads we ever found was actually just in the trunk of someone that was coming across the border, open up the trunk and here's 100 and plus pounds of marijuana that he was intending to take to Canada but had gotten lost. So that was like a funny story. But one of the biggest loads that was ever caught at Pembina was actually in the false compartment of a semi-tractor where the floor had been built so that you could lay all of the marijuana inside of it and built this fake floor over the top. And that was a direct result, really, of having not only really good X-ray systems and being able to identify that there was something wrong with that trailer and how it looked. But also, really, you cannot replace the officer. That officer is trained. They understand what to look for. Of course, the intel and our systems, our technology systems allow us to kind of hone in on something that's not right or maybe an infrequent traveler. But it's changed in that, we went from this understanding that we were going to see so much when we actually found and got the technology to now relying more on intel.
I think the first challenge is getting attention. And certainly you got my attention very early on, Mary, when I was able to come up to Portal and see the great work that you do. But we know that sensoring equipment's getting more and more sophisticated, that we can move more and more commercial traffic through if we have the right kind of equipment, and we need to invest in that technology. And I think your point is really well taken. As we look at deploying resources to all of our borders to enhance border security, the thing Customs and Border Protection will always tell us is that the vast majority of illegal drugs come across at the points of entry. And we can't just secure, the wide open spaces, but those points of entry are so critical to stopping, to contributing to stopping illegal trafficking of drugs, illegal trafficking of people, and the potential of doing great injury, honestly, to our ag markets and our ag commodities by allowing in certain foodborne bacteria or a fungus or other things that somebody may invent that would actually do incredible damage to our ag market. And so, you guys stood on the wall and you protected our state, and I am so extraordinarily grateful to everyone who puts on a blue and green uniform and who defends our borders and protects our security of our country. And Mary, you're among the finest I've met, and it's an honor to know you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And please just continue your great work for the state of North Dakota, but also for the United States, Heidi. We really are just so grateful when we have the support and the voice, really, of our senators, of our congressmen. That helps us to get our jobs done and to protect the American people.
You bet. Take care, Mary. Next up, we have Porter Fox with us, who recently released a book, Northland, and it chronicles his 4,000-mile journey along the northern border. Porter traveled by canoe, car, freighter, and foot, and his experience illustrates the vastness of the northern border and what needs to be done to protect it. Porter, you're an amazing guy. Thanks so much for sharing your incredible journey with the hot dish. And so I'm curious, because those of us who grew up in places like North Dakota, who have spent a lot of time on the northern border, we've kind of gone accustomed to the topography, accustomed to kind of accepting that Canada is our closest ally, and we have nothing to fear from Canadians, so we don't stand on guard the way we do in other parts of the world on borders. But I'm curious about, given your work, what was the biggest surprise that you had traveling those 4,000 miles?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, and it's really great to be here talking to one of the few others that are bringing attention to a lot of issues on the northern border that really need to be dealt with. I grew up in northern Maine, very different topography. I grew up on an island close to the water section of the border. The border back there runs through rivers and lakes, very small streams, in the deep woods of northern Maine, which is the North Woods are a 12 million acre stretch of largely roadless area that's very hard to patrol and keep secure. At the same time, it's full of business. There's a tremendous number of cross-border businesses there, be it timber or fishing, processing pulpwood and whatnot. The biggest surprise that I found, I would say, when I was even in my home state of Maine, straight across through the Great Lakes, through the northern plains, and even out into Washington and the Cascades and whatnot, is that every time I visited the border, every time I went to the line, and I was kind of ranging within 100 miles of it the whole time, going back and forth, documenting this North Country. When I went to the line, I would just see the most bizarre things. In northern Vermont, this apartment building that straddles the line, where Americans who are dating Canadians historically have gotten an apartment there. You get a room there. That's where you can meet up. There's a door on the Canadian side and a door on the American side. And nobody really cares. It's not that big of a deal. Up in northern Maine, there's a pulpwood factory literally built over the St. John River. Half of it is Canada. Half of it is in the U.S. For many, many years. It's just operated as a typical factory. Now there is a line painted on the floor down through the middle of the factory. A tremendous amount of paperwork and really additional cost to them to operate that factory. And so you have situations like that, and then you have so many situations that, again, I saw all the way across the border, where the border was, it was not marked. It was, if it was guarded, it was from these remote cameras and motion sensors and whatnot. But the ports of entry and the CBP were so far away that routinely people slip across. They get caught on camera or trip a motion detector, but CBP can't get there in time. And they openly acknowledge that. So those two things were probably the most surprising for me.
I think, people have an idea about the northern border, but your description of Maine, I was thinking that's pretty much what you would see in parts of Minnesota, but certainly not what you would see in North Dakota, where it would be wide open. In fact, I've seen that the border markers, basically farmers farming around them on both sides. They're
they get in the way.
Yeah, I mean, they get in the way, those markers, and you get a couple extra bushels. That could make the difference between making it or breaking it. And so I think that we share common heritage. A lot of relatives across the border. Pat Leahy is always proud to say that he married a Canadian, and we have a lot of family that cross the borders and share a cultural heritage, and I think that it becomes kind of that sleepy thing that we say, oh, it's Canada, it's just Canada, and I think it does ignore the potential threats. And when you're looking at this, if you said, if somebody said, oh, well, we shouldn't spend any money on the northern border because we've got the southern border that's problematic, or we need to beef up the Coast Guard to take care of our maritime borders, give me the best argument for why we need to do a better job with border security in the northern border.
Well, you can just look to the FBI, whose papers document that there have been more terrorist suspects apprehended in the north than in the south for the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. It makes perfect sense. It's the path of least resistance. There's different immigration policies in place in Canada. That's how they run their country. It does, for a Mexican citizen, does not require a visa. They can take a $300 flight into Toronto, and they can walk across the border if that's what they want. Another case, you have your terrorists, you have a tremendous amount of drug smuggling, of human trafficking, especially there's a dozen Indian reservations on the northern border, and because of jurisdiction issues there, it almost opens the door for opioids flowing south from Canada into the North Country, which has really just wreaked havoc on northern communities. And I'll say again that another shocking thing for me in my world, in the media world, I just can't believe how underreported a lot of these stories were. You come out with this terrific new Northern Border Security Act, and DHS, finally follows up and comes up with a new strategy and putting in an implementation plan. You can't find that anywhere in the news. I had to, I wrote a book about it, and I'm searching, trying to find, where are the documents? What do they say? When did it come out? Why was it late? Things like that. And it's just very surprising to me how little attention is given to it. And I do think it's because we historically take Canada for granted and don't see Canada as a threat. But what some Americans and politicians aren't seeing is that, sure, the country of Canada might not be a threat, but the people who are coming into Canada might be a direct threat against the United States.
I think that's right. And, one of the things that I do since I've been in office is I have a strategy. It's called my Look Up strategy. We're dealing with today's problems, and a lot of that is focused on the southwest border. But if you look at the border on the Rio Grande, or the border in, across the deserts and the terrain of New Mexico and Arizona and going into California, you say, okay, we're going to really make this border much more impenetrable, and which I agree with. But what's going to happen with that traffic? It's going to find the point of least resistance. We always say
exactly.
it's you push on a balloon someplace, it's going to pop out someplace else. And I feel kind of the same way about our maritime borders, because I hear constantly we're going to take money away from the Coast Guard and put it to beef up border security on the southwest. I'm like, that's absolutely the wrong strategy. We should be looking at a 50-state border strategy that protects our borders and recognizes that every place is a threat, a potential threat.
Absolutely. Your northern border is more than twice as long as the southern border. There are thousands of miles of forested borderland where they do this 20-foot wide cut through the forest. But when you're not in that cut, you're completely hidden by trees. It is extremely dense forest. The northern border goes over 8,000-foot peaks through the North Cascades, through the Rockies, across 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. Again, these little streams and rivers in Maine that are just impossible. I traveled along them. It was so hard to get there and to travel along the line there. It's almost impossible to patrol without some more resources, without more funding, more technology, more work with local authorities, and even local populations who that grapevine security, at least in northern Maine and across a lot of the Northland. Those local communities are kind of the last line of defense.
Yeah, you see it everywhere. And Senator Tester and I always say this, look, you've got to have a presence out there because you have to work with the local ranchers, the local farmers, the local fishermen, in your case, the local, folks who timber for a living. We've got to get to a place where we recognize that if we are going to have border protection. It isn't solely focused on the southwest border. We have got to have border protection on all of our borders. And
exactly, because they'll just find their way in.
That's right. And your work is so important, and your book is so important to continue to make that point. I know a lot of people on the southwest border, and a lot of the ranchers down there have the same concerns that ranchers would have in Montana or that farmers would have in North Dakota, which is, if I see something, who do I call and how do I know that, because you're fairly isolated. And one of the things that we've been really pushing is something you raised, which is a greater kind of level of collaboration and official relationship with our sheriffs and with our chiefs of police and with our state police. Stone Garden is critical, and it's a plus-up multiplier for securing the northern border and securing the southwest border.
It's essential, and every CBP person that I spoke with said that. They said, well, thank God for these communities, because they keep an eye on everything. But you're right, they don't always know who to call. It's an unofficial relationship. In certain parts of the border, CBP is somewhat secretive and doesn't make those relations. And it's just missing out on a huge resources. These folks have been there, a lot of them in the North Country. It's unique in that they've been there for 7, 8, 9 generations. They know the backcountry. They know where the bootlegging roads are. They know where the waterways go and how someone would travel through there. And it's a really huge resource that they're missing out on.
Yeah, it's funny that you would say the bootlegging roads, because we all know if you lived in the North during the time of Prohibition, most of the illegal liquor that came into the country came in through Canada. I mean,
Absolutely.
We have, and it's interesting because there's North Dakota has legends involving tunnels and legends involving canoes on the Red River. We have a river that flows north into Manitoba, and the traffic there for illegal liquor during Prohibition was absolutely what happened. And so it's if you want to look at can't ever happen, that you can't see a major inflow of illegal goods. All you have to do is remember what happened in during the time of Prohibition, and know that a lot of contraband did at that point and still today comes in through the northern border.
Absolutely, and it still does in northern Maine. Those bootlegging roads are still, there's hundreds of them through the forest.
I know.
So you don't have to walk across the border with a backpack. You can just drive a Jeep, and out on the water, that stretch of border that goes from Eastport and Lubec, Maine, the easternmost point of the U.S., continental U.S., when it goes out to sea, that's still a gray area. That line is still in dispute, and you can see in the headlines today, the lobstermen between Nova Scotia and Maine are having huge disputes over that. CBP is raiding Canadian boats, making sure they're not smuggling things across the border, which they historically never have. It's a bit of a mess up there in the Northeast, and again in the Northwest as well. There's huge issues between salmon fishermen up there about, where is the line?
Yeah,
they don't know. They're conflicting treaties and conflicting language.
Well,
so
it's interesting.
Get ironed out.
We also have a problem on the northern border that they don't have on the southern border, which is our waterways freeze. And that creates a whole nother conduit for people moving illegal contraband and potentially drugs and human trafficking.
Absolutely. And, of course, the border follows the deep water mark through lakes and rivers. Well, the deep water mark is constantly shifting, which on a little river doesn't make too much, of a problem. But on a big lake or a big river, it certainly does. It could be 100, 200 feet either side. And when you're getting arrested for drifting across that line in a fishing boat by accident, that really becomes, a big problem.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we've been able to do with our Northern Borders Strategy Bill is raise awareness. And, it's interesting because the Committee on Homeland Security that I serve on we have more representation of the northern border than the southern border. And so I think the fact that, Gary Peters and Ron Johnson and Heidi Heitkamp and John Tester and Maggie Hassan and, I can go through all of the representation on the northern border, Danes, Hoven, they now have an idea that it might be in their best interest to pay attention to the northern border. But your work has been so critical in raising awareness and making sure that people understand the unique challenges of the northern border. And I really think you did great work.
Thank you. And same back to you. I think your group that you just named there are really some of the few, and you spearheading it, that have brought much needed attention there, from everything from border security to cross-border trade and travel, and really trying to create a very unique and specific policy for this border, because it's a very, very unique border.
We've been talking to Porter Fox, the author of Northland, a 4,000-mile journey along America's forgotten border. Thanks so much. Let's continue to stay in touch and work for better border security for our northern neighbors.
Thank you.
We need to make sure that the priorities of the northern border are met. I'll keep working with DHS as well as their critical local, state, and federal partners to make sure that the new northern border strategy is properly implemented. As my guests illustrate today, it's a complex border with complex security needs. And if we're not doing everything we can to meet them, then we're not doing our job to keep all North Dakotans strong and safe. Thanks for listening to this helping of The Hot Dish.